It was an ordinary morning, the kind where sunlight pours gently across the streets, warming the pavement and casting soft shadows over the walls of the neighborhood. I was stepping out to collect the mail, my mind caught up in the usual, mundane thoughts of deadlines and errands. That's when I noticed her. She was on the balcony opposite mine, framed by the pale yellow light that spilled from the morning sun. She moved with a quiet grace, adjusting a row of potted plants, brushing a loose strand of hair from her face. It wasn't the way most people notice someone, no sudden sparkle or laughter, but something about her presence made the world feel narrower, sharper, more alive. Her movements were deliberate yet effortless, every gesture carrying a kind of unspoken elegance that drew my attention before I even realized it. And then our eyes met. I could feel it before I fully understood it, the immediate pull of recognition, like meeting someone whose story your soul already knows. Her eyes were calm, yet startlingly vivid, and they seemed to hold a depth that I could not yet comprehend. She didn't speak, didn't smile in the obvious way people do when introducing themselves. Instead, her gaze lingered, and in that quiet, unspoken exchange, I felt more communicated than words could ever manage. I tried to return a casual glance, a half smile, but it felt clumsy in comparison to her composed stillness. There was a pause, a shared heartbeat stretched across the space between us, where the usual noise of life faded. The distant hum of a passing car, the rustle of leaves in the breeze, even the faint chirping of birds, all of it receded until there was only her and the weight of that silent acknowledgement. I remember noticing the small details, almost obsessively, the subtle crease at the corner of her eyes, the soft movement of her fingers as they adjusted the plant pots, the gentle tilt of her head, hinting at curiosity, caution, maybe even amusement. Even the light played differently around her, catching in the strands of her hair, brushing across her cheek in a way that made her seem both real and untouchable at the same time. When I finally tore my gaze away, the warmth of her attention lingered, like the last touch of sunlight before it slips behind the horizon. I felt a flutter I hadn't anticipated, a subtle ache of anticipation, and a strange certainty that this was not just a fleeting encounter. In her silence, she had spoken volumes, opening a door I didn't yet know existed. Even as I returned to my apartment, my steps felt lighter, my senses sharper, attuned to the possibility of what might come next. Her eyes had left an imprint on me, soft, quiet, and impossible to ignore. And though I didn't know her name, hear her voice, or understand her story, I knew that something significant had begun, a slow unraveling that would start with silence but speak with the eloquence of the heart. After that first morning, I found myself noticing her everywhere, though I tried not to. The encounters were small, almost accidental, but each one left a lingering warmth I couldn't shake. Whether it was stepping out to water the plants on my balcony, or grabbing a package from the mailbox, she seemed to appear at the edges of my routine. And every time she didn't speak, but her presence spoke in a language entirely her own. One afternoon I saw her in the hallway as I was returning from the store. She was leaning slightly against the railing outside her apartment, arms crossed loosely, her hair catching the light in that same effortless glow I remembered from before. Our eyes met again, and this time there was something different, an acknowledgement that went beyond curiosity. She tilted her head slightly, almost imperceptibly, as if inviting me to notice the details of her quiet world. I felt my chest tighten in a way that was both thrilling and unsettling. The silence between us began to feel natural, like a secret we shared without needing words. Sometimes, she would wave faintly or nod when I passed, tiny gestures that carried more weight than a full conversation ever could. Other times, she'd watch from her balcony as I worked in my small garden, her eyes following my movements with quiet attention. I started noticing the little things, how she tucked her hair behind her ear, how the sunlight seemed to trace the curve of her cheek, the subtle rhythm of her breathing when she paused to look at me. One evening, I found her in the courtyard, crouched to tie her shoes. I approached cautiously, not wanting to intrude, and she didn't speak, yet her glance lifted toward me, holding an almost playful patience. I helped her with a small task, holding a book while she adjusted her bag strap, and when our hands brushed, the contact was fleeting yet electric. The warmth of her skin against mine lingered far longer than the physical touch, and for a moment, I could feel her heartbeat, steady yet intimate, as if she trusted me with a fragment of herself I had no right to possess. These silent encounters were becoming the highlight of my days. I began timing my routines just to catch glimpses of her, to feel the understated connection growing between us. I noticed her smiles, rare, subtle, almost shy, and the way her eyes seemed to soften whenever she looked at me. Each small gesture carried a weight I couldn't yet describe, a depth I had never experienced in such quiet, unspoken moments. Even in her silence, she spoke volumes. I began interpreting the flicker of her emotions, the way her shoulders relaxed when she felt comfortable, the slight tension when she was cautious, the fleeting warmth in her gaze when I was near. I was learning her language without words, translating the quiet poetry of her presence into feelings I could almost, but not entirely, name. By the time I returned home each day, I realized that the anticipation of seeing her again had become its own kind of ritual. I didn't need conversation. Her eyes, her gestures, her silent acknowledgement were enough to pull me into a world I didn't want to leave, a slow, growing intimacy that promised something deeper, waiting to be discovered. The air had begun to carry the first hints of spring, soft, warm, and filled with a kind of quiet promise. That afternoon, I found myself lingering near her apartment, ostensibly to check on a dripping faucet I had noticed while collecting the mail. It was ordinary, routine, but ordinary had a way of bending when she was near. She appeared on her balcony as I crouched to adjust the faucet, carrying a stack of folded laundry. Our eyes met again, and this time, there was no hesitation, only a quiet acknowledgement of each other's presence. She didn't speak, of course, but her gaze lingered long enough to make me feel the warmth of unspoken understanding. It was almost as if we were silently negotiating a language of gestures, a vocabulary of small intimacies that needed no words to convey meaning. As I stood, wiping my hands on a rag, she descended the short stairway leading to the garden, carrying her laundry basket. One of the bags was heavier than she expected, and instinctively, I stepped closer. "Here," I said softly, taking some of the weight. Her eyes flicked up to mine, just for a moment, and something like surprise, and maybe appreciation, flashed there. I felt my own chest tighten at the brief contact, the warmth of her fingers brushing mine as we balanced the basket together. It was subtle, almost accidental, but in that moment, I realized how much weight a small touch could carry. We walked together to the edge of the garden, side by side, the silence between us filled with the hum of birds and the faint rustle of leaves. I noticed the way her hair caught the sunlight, strands brushing her cheek, and the tilt of her head as she glanced at me. She didn't speak, but her eyes were alive, communicating curiosity, caution, and perhaps a tentative trust. I could feel it, a bridge forming, fragile and tentative, built from gestures and glances instead of words. When we set the basket down, our hands lingered near each other. I noticed the subtle shift in her posture, her shoulders slightly relaxed, her fingers brushing against mine as she rearranged the folded laundry. My heartbeat quickened, a silent acknowledgement that this was more than routine neighborly help. It was a first step into something deeper, a moment that felt both ordinary and profoundly intimate. Even as she thanked me with the faintest nod and a soft, almost imperceptible smile, I realized how much her silence had taught me. I was learning to read her expressions, her subtle movements, the nuanced language of her eyes. Each glance, each fleeting touch, carried layers of emotion I couldn't yet name but already felt deeply. By the time I returned to my apartment, I replayed the encounter over and over, the weight of the basket, the warmth of her hand brushing mine, the quiet depth of her gaze. It had been a small, fleeting moment, yet it felt monumental. For the first time, I sensed that the distance between us wasn't just physical. It was an unspoken invitation, a beginning of a connection neither of us could articulate yet, but both of us could feel. And in that silent, ordinary afternoon, the first threads of something tender and irresistible began to weave themselves between us. A slow, steady pull that promised a journey either of us could predict, but one I already longed to follow. By now, our encounters had become a quiet rhythm, almost ritualistic, though either of us had spoken more than a few sentences. There was something comforting in the unspoken language we had begun to develop, the subtle tilt of her head, the way her eyes followed me, the tiny gestures that said far more than words ever could. One late afternoon, I noticed her sitting on the low stone wall in the courtyard, a book resting on her lap, legs crossed, absorbed in its pages. I hesitated for a moment, then carried a small blanket from my balcony and approached, unsure if my gesture would be welcomed. Her eyes met mine before I even spoke, a silent question hovering there. I offered the blanket wordlessly, and she accepted it with a slight nod, draping it over her knees as if acknowledging the comfort without needing conversation. I sat nearby on the edge of the fountain, the cool stone pressing against my back, feeling a strange mixture of nervous anticipation and calm familiarity. The world around us continued, distant traffic, the occasional bird, the low murmur of other neighbors, but within that courtyard, time seemed to slow, as if the air itself recognized the intimacy forming between us. I began to notice more about her in these quiet moments. The way her fingers traced the edges of the book, the gentle sway of her hair when a breeze caught it, the subtle sigh that escaped her lips when a page ended. I felt drawn not just to her appearance, but to the rhythms of her presence, the unspoken cadence of her being. There was vulnerability there, tucked beneath her confident posture, and it called to something tender and protective in me. At one point, a leaf drifted down and landed on the page of her book. Without thinking, I reached over and brushed it away. Our hands nearly touched, and though the contact was fleeting, it left a warm resonance lingering between us. She didn't react overtly, but her eyes held something, a spark of amusement, gratitude, and perhaps something more elusive. I found myself craving these small touches, the silent acknowledgement that we were aware of each other in ways words could never capture. We stayed like that for what felt like hours, sharing the quiet without forcing it into conversation. Sometimes she would lean back slightly, as if inviting me closer, and sometimes I would shift just enough to feel her presence more acutely. Every glance, every small gesture, deepened the subtle tension and the growing trust between us. I realized that in these silent interactions, we were communicating emotions that we were not yet ready to put into words: curiosity, longing, comfort, and the tentative beginnings of attachment. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting golden streaks across the courtyard, I felt a profound sense of closeness, as if we were inhabiting a space that belonged entirely to the two of us. Her silence no longer felt like distance, it felt like intimacy. In sharing these unspoken moments, we were learning each other's language, a delicate, intricate code written in gestures, glances, and presence. By the time I finally rose to leave, a quiet ache remained in my chest, a longing for more of these moments, more of her quiet, profound company. It was in that shared stillness that I understood the truth of our connection, that words, though comforting, were unnecessary. The depth of emotion, the intimacy, and the tender pull between us had already begun to weave itself into something neither of us could yet name, but both of us already felt deeply. It was one of those evenings when the sky held a quiet tension, heavy with clouds that hinted at rain. I had just stepped out to collect a package when I saw her walking through the courtyard, balancing a stack of canvases she had been painting on. One slipped from her grasp, and instinctively I rushed to help. The sudden closeness was electric, but still understated. There were no words, only actions and the subtle language of our presence. As I steadied the fallen canvas, our hands brushed, lightly at first, but long enough to send a jolt through me. She didn't pull away. Instead, her eyes met mine with a clarity that made my pulse skip. They were luminous, full of unspoken words, and for the first time, I felt like she was letting me glimpse something private, something she hadn't shared with anyone else. There was fear there, yes, the cautious uncertainty of vulnerability, but also a quiet longing, a trust that she had decided to place, however briefly, in me. The sky opened above us just as I handed the canvas back, soft raindrops beginning to fall. We didn't move to escape the rain. Instead, we stood under its gentle rhythm, and I could feel the warmth of her presence as close as the space between our shoulders. Her hair was damp along the edges, strands clinging lightly to her cheeks, and the air smelled faintly of rain and the faint perfume she always wore. There was no need for words, the look in her eyes said it all. Gratitude, fear, trust, and something else, something deeper and more complicated, that pulled at me like a tide. For a moment, the world fell away. The hum of distant cars, the rustle of leaves, even the patter of rain against the pavement faded into insignificance. There was only her, standing there silently, letting the language of her gaze speak where her lips remained closed. I could sense the hesitation in her posture, the way her hands twitched slightly at her sides, and yet the undeniable courage in letting me be near her. It was an intimate confession without a single syllable, a revelation carried entirely in the depths of her eyes. I reached out instinctively, letting my hand brush hers again, this time lingering just a moment longer. The warmth of her skin against mine was grounding, and I felt an almost overwhelming mix of protectiveness and tenderness. My chest tightened as I realized how much this silent communication had grown between us. It was no longer curiosity or fascination, it was connection. Something tender, fragile, and impossibly compelling. When the rain finally lightened, she stepped back slightly, a faint, almost imperceptible smile curving her lips. I mirrored it, feeling an unspoken understanding settle between us, like a bridge that had been quietly built over countless small gestures. Our silence was no longer an absence. It was a language in itself, carrying the weight of emotion we were only just beginning to comprehend. As I watched her walk back to her apartment, her eyes lingered on me for a heartbeat longer than necessary. And in that simple, fleeting glance, I felt the full intensity of the connection we shared, a silent confession, a promise, and the quiet thrill of knowing that we were on the verge of something neither of us could yet name, but both of us already felt. The days had begun to blend into a delicate rhythm of silent meetings and fleeting touches. Each encounter carried a weight, a quiet tension, as if the world itself held its breath around us. That afternoon, I found her sitting on the balcony, her favorite scarf draped loosely around her shoulders. The sky was pale and overcast, filtering a soft, gray light through the neighborhood, and everything felt hushed, intimate, as if we were alone in a universe that existed only for the two of us. She didn't speak when I approached, but her eyes lifted to meet mine, revealing a vulnerability that had always been hidden beneath her composed exterior. There was hesitation there, a subtle tremor in the way she held her hands, as though she were considering whether to let me enter her quiet world, or retreat back behind the walls she had built. I sensed the weight of unspoken fears, past hurts, and the caution of someone who had lived through life carefully, observing before letting anyone close. I sat beside her, careful not to bridge the space too quickly, allowing her the comfort of choice. The silence stretched, not awkward but heavy with possibility. I could feel her awareness of my presence in the faint brush of our shoulders and the occasional meeting of our glances. It was a delicate dance, each of us navigating the boundaries of comfort and curiosity, trust and hesitation. When a gust of wind disturbed her scarf, I instinctively reached out to smooth it back over her shoulders. Our fingers brushed lightly, lingering just a fraction longer than necessary. She didn't pull away, but neither did she lean into the touch. Instead, she let the contact exist in its own quiet space, a language we had been learning slowly, one gesture at a time. Her eyes met mine then, luminous and expressive, conveying a multitude of emotions without a single word, gratitude, apprehension, and something softer, warmer, that made my chest ache. I noticed the faint tremor of her hand as she reached for a cup of tea, the small sigh that escaped her lips when she set it down. These little details, almost invisible to anyone else, spoke volumes to me. Her vulnerability was real, tender, and precious, and I found myself wanting to honor it, to move carefully, respectfully, and with intention. I reached for her hand again, letting it rest near mine, the warmth of skin against skin amplifying the unspoken intimacy. She didn't speak, but her eyes softened, a silent acknowledgement of trust and connection. In that moment, I understood the delicate balance of our bond. We were close, yet careful, connected, yet cautious. The hesitation between us wasn't distance, it was respect, and awareness of the fragile emotional space we were both navigating. Every glance, Every touch, every subtle gesture became an affirmation that we could be near each other without words, that our emotions could be communicated in silence, and that the connection we were building was worth nurturing slowly. As the light dimmed, I felt a warmth in my chest that wasn't just physical. It was the quiet satisfaction of being trusted, of being allowed to witness her vulnerability without judgment. I rose to leave, giving her space to breathe, and she met my eyes once more, a glance brimming with emotion, lingering just long enough to tell me that this journey, cautious though it was real. And in that hesitation, that vulnerability, we found the deepest intimacy of all, the unspoken promise of something tender, slowly unfolding, and undeniably ours. The evening had a softness to it, the kind of calm that felt almost sacred. The sun was setting, spilling golden light across the neighborhood, brushing the walls of our apartments with warmth. I found her in the courtyard, sitting on the low stone wall where we had spent so many quiet moments together. She held a cup of tea, the steam rising slowly into the cool air, curling around her like a gentle halo. I approached, feeling the familiar flutter in my chest, the anticipation of a silent communion that had become both comforting and thrilling. Her eyes met mine immediately, wide and luminous, reflecting the dying sunlight in a way that made it impossible to look away. There was no hesitation, no caution this time, only a quiet acknowledgement of everything we had shared, a recognition of the journey we had been on together. I sat beside her, leaving just enough space between us to honor the subtle intimacy we had cultivated. The air was heavy with unspoken words, but somehow, in that silence, everything that mattered was already being said. I noticed the little things I had come to cherish. The way her fingers curled around the cup, the tilt of her head as she glanced at me, the soft rise and fall of her shoulders as she breathed. I reached out slowly, letting my hand brush against hers. This time, she didn't flinch or hesitate. Her fingers intertwined gently with mine, and I felt the warmth of her touch spread through me, quiet and steady, as if the world had shrunk to the space between us. We sat together like that, side by side, letting the evening surround us. The distant hum of the neighborhood, the rustle of leaves, even the fading light itself seemed to accentuate the closeness we shared. She rested her head lightly against my shoulder, and the faint weight of her presence grounded me in a way I hadn't known I needed. Her eyes, when they lifted to meet mine, held something I had been waiting for all along: trust, affection, and a silent declaration of the connection that had been growing between us from the very first glance. There was laughter too, soft, unforced, as we shared small observations about the day, subtle jokes that needed no words to convey their intimacy. Each gesture, each glance, each touch carried a tenderness that neither of us had needed to name. The distance that had existed between us, the hesitations and vulnerabilities, had dissolved into a quiet certainty that this bond, built in silence and subtlety, was real and enduring. As the sky deepened into twilight, I realized that the story we had been writing together didn't need grand declarations. It was in the lingering touches, the shared silences, the steady warmth of presence. I felt her hand tighten slightly in mine, a gentle affirmation that we were both here, fully present, fully aware of what had grown between us. In that moment, I knew we had arrived, not at an ending, but at a place of emotional completeness. The slow burn of curiosity, tension, and intimacy had blossomed into something tender, mutual, and deeply human. We didn't need words. Her eyes had always said everything, and now, in the quiet glow of the evening, we could finally let our hearts speak through presence, touch, and trust. As we watched the last light fade together, side by side, I felt a profound warmth settle over me, a knowledge that this connection, built in patience and understanding, would remain unshakable, a testament to what can grow when two people truly see each other, even in silence.